She had always worn a brave face in front of the world, as though nothing could break her. People often admired her for her strength, her independence, and the way she carried herself with dignity even when life seemed cruel. But no one really knew how heavy her heart was, how many nights she cried silently behind closed doors, or how much she longed for someone to just notice her pain without her having to say a single word. On this particular evening, the loneliness inside her had grown unbearable. She walked through the streets aimlessly, trying to convince herself that she was fine, but her tears betrayed her strength, rolling down her cheeks faster than she could wipe them away. Without realizing it, her feet had carried her to his house. He wasn't just any man. He was someone who had always been quietly present in her life. He was the one who checked on her when no one else did, the one who noticed when she wasn't herself, even if she pretended otherwise. He never demanded anything from her, never forced his way into her world, but simply stayed in the background like a steady flame, waiting in case she ever needed warmth. That night, she needed it more than ever. With trembling hands, she knocked on his door. For a moment she thought of turning back, ashamed of showing him this side of her, afraid that he might misunderstand her presence. But before she could change her mind, the door opened. He stood there, surprised to see her at such a late hour, but his expression softened immediately when he noticed the tears in her eyes. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't demand explanations. He simply opened the door wider and said softly, "Come in." She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The warmth of his home wrapped around her like an embrace she hadn't known she needed. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, but no words came out. She could only lower her head and let her silence explain what she couldn't. He didn't push her. Instead, he guided her to the couch, handed her a glass of water, and let her sit in peace. She clutched the glass in her hands, staring at it as though it could stop her tears, but the weight of all she had been holding in finally broke her down. With a shaky breath, she whispered, "I just couldn't be alone tonight." Those words pierced the quiet air, and in them he heard everything she wasn't saying. He understood her pain without needing further details. He nodded gently, his eyes never leaving hers, and said, "You don't have to explain." There was such sincerity in his tone that it disarmed her completely. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't need to be strong. She didn't need to hide her scars or pretend that she was fine. She sat there, her shoulders trembling, as tears slipped freely down her cheeks. He quietly fetched a blanket and draped it over her shoulders, the gesture so simple yet so profound that it made her heart ache even more. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, only a deep care that made her wonder why she had fought so hard to face her battles alone when someone like him existed in her world. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of her quiet sobs fading into calmer breaths. He didn't try to fill the space with words or questions. Instead, he sat nearby, just close enough for her to know she wasn't alone. That presence, steady and comforting, was exactly what she had needed. Her exhaustion finally took over, and without realizing it, she drifted off to sleep, her head resting against the arm of the couch, her hands still clutching the blanket around her. He watched her for a long time, his heart heavy with emotions he dared not voice. He had always admired her strength, but tonight he saw her vulnerability, and it made him care for her even more deeply. He whispered a quiet prayer that she would find peace, that the burdens she carried would become lighter, and that she would one day see how deserving she was of love, safety, and happiness. He adjusted the blanket once more, making sure she was warm, before leaning back in his chair, his eyes still on her. That night wasn't about romance or passion. It wasn't about confessions or promises. It was about something purer, an unspoken bond, a silent understanding, and the comfort of knowing that even in the darkest hours, she wasn't alone. She had come to him in her most fragile state, and he had offered her nothing but safety, respect, and kindness. For her, it was a night of shelter from the storm raging inside her heart. For him, it was a reminder that sometimes love is shown not in words but in the quiet way you hold someone's world together when they are falling apart. The night grew deeper and silence wrapped around the little house like a blanket. The world outside seemed distant, almost forgotten, as the quiet hum of the clock on the wall became the only sound filling the room. She lay on the couch, finally still, her breathing steady as sleep pulled her away from the weight of her sorrow. He sat nearby in the armchair, his eyes fixed on her peaceful face. For the first time that evening, she no longer looked broken. In her sleep there was a softness that reminded him of who she really was beneath the layers of pain, a woman who had endured too much but still carried a fragile strength within her. He couldn't help but feel protective, a kind of care that went beyond words. There was no temptation in his heart, no selfish desire, only an overwhelming urge to guard her peace. The world had been unkind to her, he knew that much, and he silently vowed that as long as she was under his roof she would know nothing but safety. She shifted slightly in her sleep, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He reached out, adjusting it so it covered her properly, careful not to wake her. His hand lingered for a moment, not touching her but hovering just above, as though he was afraid that if he did she might break. There was something sacred about her vulnerability, something that made him respect her even more. Memories of her came rushing back. The times he had seen her smile even when she was hurting, the way she carried herself with grace despite the storms inside her. He had always admired her from a distance, never daring to let his feelings surface, because he respected her too much to risk shattering the fragile friendship they shared. But tonight, watching her here in his home, something inside him shifted. He realized just how deeply she mattered to him. The hours dragged on, but he didn't feel restless. Instead, he found peace in simply being there, watching over her. At times, he closed his eyes and whispered quiet prayers under his breath. He prayed that she would find the happiness she deserved, that her battles would finally end, and that she would learn to see herself the way he saw her, a woman worth more than all the pain she had endured. A soft sigh escaped her lips as she stirred, her face tightening for a moment as though caught in a dream. He leaned forward instinctively, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay, you're safe here," he murmured, even though she couldn't hear him. The words weren't for her alone, they were a reminder to himself of the promise he had silently made. The night air was cool, but inside the house there was warmth, not just from the heater but from the unspoken bond forming between them. He realized that sometimes the greatest acts of love are not in grand gestures but in the quiet choices we make to put someone else's peace above our own. For him it was choosing to sit there all night, keeping watch, ensuring that nothing disturbed her rest. As the hours slipped by, fatigue began to settle into his own body. His eyes grew heavy, but every time he felt himself drifting off, he fought it back, unwilling to let his guard down completely. He didn't know why he felt such an urgency to stay awake, only that it mattered. She had trusted him enough to come here, to let herself collapse in front of him, and he refused to let that trust go unguarded. He thought of the many nights she had likely spent alone, crying into her pillow with no one to hear her. That thought tightened his chest with a pain he couldn't describe. He wished he had been there sooner, wished he could have carried some of her burdens before they grew so heavy. But he also knew that tonight was not about regrets, it was about being present, about making sure she never again felt the crushing weight of loneliness while he was around. Eventually, unable to resist the exhaustion pressing down on him, he leaned back in the armchair, his gaze still locked on her. His eyelids closed slowly, but even in sleep his posture remained protective, like a silent guardian watching over something precious. The night stretched on quietly, and though no words were exchanged, something profound had settled between them. She, in her unspoken plea for comfort, had shown him a side of herself no one else had seen. He, in his silent vigil, had offered her more than shelter. He had given her proof that kindness still existed, that not everyone would walk away when she was at her weakest. By the time dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, the night had carved an invisible thread between them, fragile but unbreakable. He had sat awake for her, prayed for her, cared for her in ways she might never fully know, and when morning came it would no longer be just about comfort, it would be about something far deeper, something that neither of them yet had words for, but both of them felt in the quiet beats of the night. The morning sun crept gently into the room, spilling golden light across the floor and dancing on the edges of the blanket that covered her. The world outside was waking up with its usual rhythm, birds chirping softly, the distant sound of life beginning again, but inside there was stillness almost sacred. She stirred slowly, her eyelids fluttering open, adjusting to the brightness. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, but then the events of the previous night came back in a rush, the tears, the knock on his door, the way he had let her in without hesitation, and the peace she had finally found on his couch. She sat up quickly, brushing the blanket from her shoulders, a wave of embarrassment rushing over her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to let anyone see her so weak, so undone. She had prided herself on carrying her struggles alone, and now here she was, in his home, after spending the night like someone who had nowhere else to go. She looked at him, slumped in the armchair across the room, asleep but still facing her, as though even in rest he hadn't let go of his promise to keep watch. The sight of him like that, his head tilted slightly, his body stiff from the uncomfortable chair, sent a strange ache through her chest. Quietly, she rose, trying not to wake him. Her mind was already filled with apologies, with explanations she felt she owed him. She wanted to say she hadn't meant to be a burden, that she hadn't come to him for pity, only for a brief escape from her loneliness. She wanted to tell him she would leave before he realized how broken she really was. But before she could take a step, his eyes opened, catching her in that fragile moment. There was no irritation in his gaze, no surprise, only a calm certainty that seemed to disarm every excuse she had prepared. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice rough from sleep but warm enough to make her freeze where she stood. She stumbled through an apology, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to explain herself. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to stay this long. I shouldn't have come like this. But he raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You don't have to explain," he said firmly. "You don't owe me an apology." His eyes held hers, steady and unwavering, and she felt the lump in her throat grow tighter. She had expected judgment, maybe even pity, but what she found instead was something deeper, understanding, acceptance, and something she couldn't quite name. She tried again to speak, but he cut her off with words she never imagined hearing. "You don't have to stand alone anymore," he said quietly. "From today you don't just have a place here for the night. You have a place here for life. From now on, you're not just someone I care about. You're my wife." The word struck her like a wave, leaving her breathless. For a long moment she simply stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any clue that he was speaking out of impulse. But there was none. His eyes were steady, his expression calm, and his voice carried the kind of conviction that could not be faked. Her heart raced, torn between disbelief and an ache that longed to believe every word. This was a man who had known her weakness, who had seen her most vulnerable state, and instead of walking away, he was offering her something she had never dared to dream of, a lifetime of not being alone. She felt her lips tremble as she tried to form words, but nothing came out. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the quiet morning light and the beating of her heart. He stood then, crossing the room with deliberate steps, closing the distance that her doubts had created. Gently he took her hand in his touch firm yet tender, grounding her in a way that nothing else had ever done. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered. "Last night you came here for comfort. Today I'm telling you you'll never need to knock on another door again. This is your home. I am your home." Tears blurred her vision, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had been prepared to apologize, to leave quietly and never speak of the night again. Instead, she found herself standing in front of a man who had turned her moment of weakness into a moment of belonging. She felt her walls begin to crumble, piece by piece, as the truth of his words sank in. For the first time in years she wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she was standing still, being seen and being chosen. The morning sun bathed them both in light, as though the universe itself was blessing the promise he had just spoken. She realized then that the night she had thought was about comfort had transformed into something far greater. It was the beginning of a vow, a bond that went beyond shelter and kindness. It was the morning she was no longer just herself, she was his, and he was hers. Tears filled her eyes, but they no longer carried the heaviness of sorrow. They were lighter now, carrying relief, carrying the quiet joy of finally being seen after years of feeling invisible. She tried to look away, to hide the trembling of her lips, but he gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. There was no hesitation in him, no trace of doubt, only a promise unspoken yet already etched into every word he had just given her. She realized in that moment that she was standing on the edge of something she had never thought possible, a life where she no longer had to fight every battle alone. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, her vulnerability laid bare. "You could have anyone. Why choose the broken woman who showed up at your door in the middle of the night crying?" Her voice cracked on the last word, shame flooding her cheeks, but he only smiled, the kind of smile that carried both tenderness and certainty. "Because," he said softly, "you've always been the strongest person I know. You call yourself broken, but I see someone who has carried herself through storms most wouldn't survive. You came here last night not because you're weak, but because for once you allowed yourself to lean on someone. And if you let me, I want to be that someone for every night, for every morning, for every tomorrow." The simplicity of his words unraveled her. She had never been told that her strength mattered, never been loved for the scars she carried. People had admired her for what she did, for how she endured, but no one had ever wanted to step into the fire with her. And now here he was, not only willing to step into her fire but to walk through it, holding her hand. Her tears fell faster, but she did not turn away. She let them fall because for once they didn't feel like a weakness, they felt like release, like a dam breaking open after years of silence. He pulled her gently into his arms, wrapping her in the kind of embrace that made the world outside disappear. She could feel the steadiness of his heartbeat against her cheek, a rhythm that seemed to whisper promises without words. Safe, loved, home. Minutes passed, but neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer heavy. It was healing, filled with the unspoken truth that sometimes love does not arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the simple act of being there when the other person needs you most. It had come to her on a night when she had only been searching for comfort, but it had revealed itself in the morning as something far greater, a bond that would last a lifetime. When she finally pulled back, he brushed a strand of hair from her face, his eyes holding hers as though the rest of the world didn't exist. "You don't have to answer me now," he said gently, "but I need you to know that my words weren't just comfort. I meant them. I want a life with you, not just one night, not just one morning, every day, every sunrise, every storm. I want all of it with you." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she simply nodded, the smallest of gestures, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. Her acceptance was quiet, but it was enough. He smiled again, his hand still cradling hers as though afraid she might slip away if he let go. The sunlight grew stronger, bathing the room in warmth. She glanced around, the blanket still draped over the couch, the chair where he had sat to watch over her, the room that had been nothing more than his house the night before. But now it felt different. Now it felt like something more, like the first place where she could finally lay her burdens down without fear of judgment. And in that moment she realized that love had not come to her in the way she had always imagined. It hadn't been the grand confession under starlit skies or the perfect proposal in a crowded room. It had come to her when she was raw, when she was unguarded, when she thought she had nothing left to give. It had come in the form of a man who didn't need her to be perfect, who wanted her just as she was. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her voice soft but steady as she whispered, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you." His arms tightened around her in response, and for the first time in years she believed that the future could be something worth looking forward to. The night she had stayed for comfort had turned into a morning that changed everything. She had walked through his door seeking a place to rest her weary soul, and she had found not only rest but a home, a partner, and a love she never thought she deserved. And as the day stretched ahead of them, one truth settled deep in her heart. She was no longer alone. She was his, and he was hers, and together they would write the rest of their story.